I think I can't remember, it's Lupita Nyong'o or Chadwick Boseman's character. They say welcome home, you know.
Yeah, Okoye, yeah.
You know, we glide into the valley, right? And
Yeah.
there was this kind of sense of like, you know, really being captured in that moment. And I'm a kind of cynical Hollywood viewer, you know, everything, I don't care what kind of film it is, I'm viewing it through the cynical lens when I look at Hollywood. But there, you know, I felt the goosebumps. And I think it was because, you know, it was the first time that you had seen the massive power of the Hollywood storytelling apparatus, right?
Right.
Geared toward a celebration of Africa and Blackness. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
and that, you know, you really began to appreciate like these stories that are being told by Hollywood are so influential and so powerful, right? And we've just never had the opportunity to see it geared toward, invested in a kind of narrative of Blackness in that way. You know, I think that that was really, for me, that was what was so consequential and sort of pivoting about that moment, you know, when Black Panther came out. Of course, Chadwick Boseman being at the heart of that narrative was, you know, I mean, that's why I mean, if he wasn't in Black Panther, we wouldn't really be talking about him right now, although he was a great actor, right? But it's his central place in that narrative, which was just so powerful, that I think was, you know, it will be forever remembered, you know?
And there's one thing I have to say about Chadwick Boseman, God rest his soul in peace, is what I loved most is the choice to play the African man you never see. The vulnerable, the quiet, the soft-spoken. I loved. I was like, oh my God, we are not seeing, you know, the wild man in the bush. We're not seeing the man who is like cutting people down with machetes. We're just seeing this introspective character, which is most of the African men I know. I like that. They're very introspective. So it was just, for me, wonderful to see that Black man on screen. I celebrated that much.
I think that for me, what was most striking, aside from the fact that I felt an affirmation, I felt such an extraordinary out loud sense of pride about my Africanness and being connected to that, and knowing my genetic connections to that as well. But I think what struck me the most were seeing people from all over the world. I mean, people that you would never think in a million years embracing it. I mean, 100% embracing it. And again, it was a moneymaker. Let's not forget, it topped the charts where you thought, oh yeah, only maybe Black folks watch it. Everyone all over the world leaned in and were like, Black Panther. Little kids, I saw little kids wanting the Black Panther, fighting over the Black Panther, little white kids fighting over the little Black Panther, the one that was left on the shelf. I mean, it to me was, I mean, the timing of this with all the crazy going on right now, the timing of, it seems to me almost like a mystical thing. I know this sounds like I'm stepping out, but the fact that this happened, and on the heels of that, you have America pushing back, right? America pushing back and the killings and all of that, but the world has already seen the truth. The world's already seen it. And so to me, it was like, oh my God, thank God that happened. Thank that God it happened when it did. Because it created an image that no one wanted to believe. It created images for every child all over the world that says, my God, I didn't get this right. But in reality, when you start looking at the African influence, which is what I want us to get into next, is to look at the African-American Black influence on film. And giving us a historical perspective, but its significance. And I, you know, again, I heard you say the Chitlin circuit. My husband talks about that often with musicians and that whole, you know, the whole vaudeville piece that happened. But I want to really talk about the significance of Black artistry historically, and how that has really indeed influenced what we are looking at today.
Okay, before you jump to there, I just have one thing to mention to you. So one, I wanted to say to Paris, one of the things I thought about when you talk about the connection between the African and the African-American in general, I like the fact that T'Challa, because when you see Black people walking down the street, when you see a Black man walking down the street, there's nobody, Africans don't walk like black men either, right? So African men don't always walk the way that black men walk. So there was a combination in his character to me that had that vulnerability, not just for the African man, but the vulnerability for the African American man, because again, he walked with power and presence of nobility, knowing who he was and who he came from, which is what I see in Africans, but also the swagger and the strength of the black man in America. So it was a combination of those two that I think that we both saw that we see. That's how those are the men that I know, right? That he came to the room and that space was very much like the black men in my family. And at the same time, you had that other side where it was like, oh, and this is the regal African man also. It was
and can I say this? Because it would be I would literally be slaughtered for not saying this. I'm telling you, I turned on the screen and I saw women who looked like me. And I was like, yes. We don't get screen time very much.
No, right.
We very rarely get love
interest. It was very melanated. It was melanated. Melanated.
You had two directors in that film. So you had the wisdom of Ryan Coogler, but a veteran actually in Chadwick Boseman, who had been directing and teaching acting and filmmaking before he even got 42 and that starring role, I think it was 2013. Before he got that film, here's a veteran. So he was bringing his abilities as a director on set. For example, in the fight scenes, when they're deciding who's going to be the Black Panther, for example, the movements, the dancing, the sort of warrior-esque and the energy there, that was the direction of Chadwick Boseman, encouraging Ryan Coogler to add that into the film. So a lot of what you're seeing is folks who are veteran actors, as well as bringing veteran presence behind the camera to sort of bring this to life. And I can share that a colleague from South Africa was telling me that this film brought pride to South Africa and was arguing that it brought pride to the entire continent of Africa in a way that we've not seen on this magnitude. A film that made, $1.29 billion from a kid from Oakland. Who would have thought a kid from the inner city of Oakland could put a film on screen and made $1.29 billion? Just shy of the domestic numbers of Titanic by maybe a couple $1 million. Magnificent.
See, I always say, Dr. Joy, do you remember? I always say when Africans and African Americans come together, magic happens.
Magic. I say that. Listen, okay, as a West African dancer, right? This is so hilarious because not all Africans dance, not all Black people sing, okay? But I know that it's so funny when I have friends of mine who are African who don't dance and are like, it's a thing. So I'm an African dancer, right? We go to places and when we connect in dance and in music, it's magic in that space. But what I was excited about is seeing the magic happen in that movie. It was a unified pride. It wasn't that disconnect that you talked about that we experience sometimes. There was none of that. And I have to say, just physically seeing brown chocolate people in the lead was, I don't even know what to tell you. That level, and people take that for granted. But you were talking about that level of melanin. It's not like, oh, they're Black people. Yeah, they're Black people. But sometimes, my children used to act, right? So I would take them to these casting calls and you would see a rainbow of children playing the Black child. Okay, you go, how are you playing the Black child, right? The Black parents' children never match the parents. That's what I liked about us. The parents match the kids. But usually when you show up to those casting calls, you got all kinds of biracial, little tiny dot of Black that are playing the Black child role. And in this particular movie, you saw a lot of brownness, which I think also was striking.
That's beautiful. It's beautiful to look at. For me, at least, I was like, wow.
It was beautiful for me too. I was quite excited.
This is beautiful.
Right. I mean, I think one of the things that is underscoring the point that you're making, but here's right, is a diversity of Blackness that is legible within that film, right? So it's not like Blackness is this monolithic thing, right? I mean, that's one of the things I liked about kind of like the sort of like the region of Wakanda, right? It wasn't just one thing. It was like this diversity of cultures coming together within Wakanda, and it kind of emphasized that, obviously Africa, but Blackness, is so diverse, right? And you can't, And that's only really possible to display when you have these kind of, saturated kind of Black ensemble casts, because so much of even those performances which made this great impression on Hollywood history, like you're talking about, Joy, right? So many of those come in the context of a single Black actor sort of working their craft within and in contrast to a kind of a sea of whiteness, right? And so obviously there's so much excellence that was demonstrated in those kinds of roles, but then that kind of Black totality or, near totality that you see in a film like Black Panther, I think dramatizes for audiences the richness, right? The breadth, the diversity of what Blackness actually is.
Yeah. It was a very for our children and members of our family. It was so wonderful to see this. I mean, it's enviable. I mean, it was enviable when I saw those Black women. I was like, wait a minute, they were so regal. They were so powerful. They were so feminine. They were so all of it. And it was a moment for me where I felt like my granddaughter, my grandchildren. I have grandchildren that are half Ethiopian. I have that we have the rainbow, of course, in our family. But just to be able to celebrate that Blackness was just so. I mean, I've never had that experience. I literally never had that experience in my 62 years. So I held on to that, and then having the ability to engage with different people who have been in film and that are looking at film. I'm so glad to have you all here that are able to speak to, that people will be calling on to help inform future film instead of having the white gaze on whatever it is that's going on, the white interpretation of it. Really, there were times, you all probably don't remember this, when they would have white people playing Asians, white people playing Indians, white people, it was white people playing everybody. And therefore there was not even this appreciation. I remember Bruce Lee, the story of Bruce Lee and the stuff that happened to him. They didn't want to use for Kung Fu, they used a white man. You know what I'm saying? And yet it was based on, on him. And so there on Bruce Lee, who was this phenomenal person. And so for me, I'm curious about the history. I'm really curious about what you all can tell us about the history of film that our audience needs to know that they may not know. You are the experts in that, and I would like to hear a little bit about that. That would be the history people.
Yeah, history people. I'm looking at them like,
okay, you're right.
Why don't you go ahead, Tim?
You're going to go this time. I went first last time. You go.
So the history of film. Well, when I teach the early history of representations of African Americans in Hollywood, the one thing that I try to emphasize to students is that we have to realize that that's coming out of a stream of popular entertainment, which goes back to the early part of the 19th century in America, right? And so that's coming out of the tradition of minstrelsy, right? And we know that minstrelsy is this kind of combination of song and dance and drama, which was primarily about the devaluation and humor, which could be produced by that devaluation of Black people, right? And so, of course, it begins with white people doing exactly what you're talking about, white people in their fascination, basically, with Blackness, painting themselves Black and then doing this demeaning work, right? And then it evolves into Black people taking on these roles, which are essentially demeaning, right? And so the history of popular, and people forget that the most popular form of entertainment throughout the 19th century in America is blackface minstrelsy. People don't that's the movies. That's what people are exposed to. That's what's going from town to town to town, sort of acculturating people into a certain kind of understanding of what Blackness is through media, right? And then so Hollywood tradition emerges from that. It emerges from that sort of that kind of representation. And so that's why if you go back to these men, not all, but almost all of these early representations, you get these horrible kind of caricatures of Black life. And of course, we know, the film that I always begin with is The Birth of a Nation, which is a piece of Ku Klux Klan propaganda that comes out in 1915. And most of the Black characters are played by whites in blackface, right? And of course, all that is done is the demeaning of Black life, and perhaps more crucially, the demonstration of the way in which Black power would inevitably lead to the breakdown of civilization, right? That's what Birth of a Nation is all about. And so if these kinds of minstrel show representations were so powerful in shaping the American imagination in the 19th and early 20th century, once Hollywood comes to the fore in shaping the American imagination, is perpetuating those same ideas. And the one thing I'll just say this before stopping here, right, is that what a lot of people kind of don't recognize about The Birth of a Nation is that it was or some people notice, right, it was a groundbreaking technological film, right, in terms of technology they used and the length of the film, right? And so the filmmaker himself, D.W. Griffith, he had to fight against his studio to make it because they didn't want to invest so much money in making this long film, right? So what happened is he got a whole bunch of investors. He said, I know this is going to work. I know this is going to work. Invest in my film, invest in my film. And so they all did that. And when it turned out to be a blockbuster that returned the investment of those speculative sort of friends of his tenfold, that was what said to people, oh, this can really work. Right. That was what led to basically the streaming of the film industry into Los Angeles, which of course is which became the core industry of Los Angeles and led to the emergence of this metropolis over the course of the 20th century, right? So, this kind of piece of Ku Klux Klan propaganda, which is immensely lucrative, is part of the reason that Los Angeles even exists as a major American metropolis and major world metropolis today.
Wow. That I actually show Birth of a Nation, only parts of it, because of the nature of the class I teach, of my online course. And the thing that was so striking about this, when the images and the beliefs, the piece that stood out for me was, again, we need to protect white women from this ravaging mulatto who, because that's it, they're just going to ravage white women. And she had to, throw herself off a cliff to avoid the clutches of this black man. Now that, these Black people are free, here's what we have to contend with. What I struggle with is the absolute opposite was true. And that was the ravaging and the raping of Black women and women of color, right? These were the things that were really going on. And yet those images, again, the power of Hollywood, and that literally had impacted the lynching that occurred. I mean, these things are so connected and we are so ignorant about them. That's why I think this conversation is so important, because it wasn't just a film, you see, it was propaganda. It did set up that dynamic of fear and hate and this whole idea of, Black people, you let them into an arena, they're going to they're not going to have shoes on, they're going to be eating chicken, all of those things, we look at and we laugh at, but then when we move into the exploitation time, which I really want you to speak to as well, is the other films that started to show up about Blackness, but that was still run by and being promoted by white powerhouses.
I very early on, looking at the early inventions of camera technology and film stock, etc. I mean, looking at Thomas Edison, I mean, he would have had no luck and no love had it not been for Lewis Latimer and sort of his inspiration into the filament, which is the synthesis of the light bulb. How the cameras are not functioning, projection systems are not functioning without light, and light is a key source in film. So none of these things are talked about. And Thomas Edison was one of the biggest out there. One of his early what they called actualities, which were these experiments that we would put in the documentary realm now, these short films, was a film called 10 Little Pickaninnies, where he had black children who were definitely dressed in sort of tattered and clothing you would see during chattel slavery, and their hair matted or looking in this example of what they said a pickaninny looked like, which is sort of the younger version of the pure coon or the coon, right? Someone who's less than, lacking intelligence, whose only excitement is to eat fried chicken and watermelon. They don't have much intelligence, right? So early on, we see 10 Little Pickaninnies. And as we then transition years later into Birth of a Nation, we see glorified that these folks are coons. Look what they do if we put them in Congress. There's a scene where they're in Congress, they have their feet on the desk, they have no shoes on, they're acting like children who are not getting their way. They're not to be trusted. Look at how they're going to treat the white folks. The tragic mulatto you mentioned, Joy, and she's this woman she's lacking intelligence, and of course she has to be controlled by white men, and she's raped, and she just can't control her sexual urges. And then the buck in blackface, you have the buck in blackface, who is this domineering black man he's full of vigor and sexual energy and rage, and all he wants to rape white women and kill white men. These are the images perpetuated in this film. And there's about 8 archetypes in total, but these are the ones that are really shine forth. Dr. John Hope Franklin, African-American historian, said the film did more than any other single thing to nurture and promote the myth of Black domination and debauchery during Reconstruction, from slavery to freedom. The first film shown in the White House, 1915, by a former history teacher and President Woodrow Wilson, who showed that film, and he glorifies that film.
Loved the film. Promoted.
Yeah, so after this film, we see a rise of the new Ku Klux Klan. So Ku Klux Klan, from the old Ku Klux Klan, we have a new version of it rising, and a lot of the bigotry in that film was then promoted for years to come, and I would argue up until today. And then we move into this period of sort of the jester, which was glorified in that film, right? The lacking intelligence coon. So these, we have the step and fetch it, right, of the world, and this really sort of promoting that we are lacking intelligence, and we kind of talk as if we are struggling with some type of mental illness or retardation of some sort. And you have of other sorts in terms of the mammy was even perpetuated in the servant act following that, and just that we're in these subservient roles and less than. The Aunt Jemima was perpetuated, which is a cousin to the mammy. She may not always be, the mammy is one who they argue is more heavy-set African-American woman, followed by the Aunt Jemima. And all of these types of roles were perpetuating these bigoted stereotypes that take us back into chattel slavery in America. And so we then go from that into this period of what I like to call the star period, where you start seeing folks who are musicians or are very elegant in terms of voice, who are in these nightclubs or very nice concert halls, who are part of films. And that's when you sort of see then the transition into folks like a Dorothy Dandridge and others to whom would follow in these types of roles. Lena Horne is another one, a little bit before Dorothy Dandridge. Lena Horne is another actress that comes to mind. By the way, who was at one point blacklisted out of Hollywood.
Right.
Paul Robeson before her. And I want to say this, through all of this chaos, Paul Robeson was not playing roles as a coon, and he's making films in the 1920s on post-1927. So blackface sort of took a pause and wasn't as popular post-1927 when we have sound and film start to emerge. Although I find it interesting that The Jazz Singer, starring Al Jolson, was a blackface film about a black jazz singer. But after that, on. And then we move into the 1960s, where we see this interesting period. Now that you're starting to see some films come out about protesting what is going on. And you start to see, as you move into the late 1960s, this emergence of Black writers and directors that are going to take us into the Blaxploitation period. And perhaps I'll stop there. I could go on and get us into to the age.
So my question is, so first of all, I appreciate all this
Thank
history.
you.
And
Thank
I think
you.
a lot of people, especially young people right now, don't know a lot of that history. I think it's the same thing when we get into music history, but we can stick with film. What I'm wondering to know, this has just been, so I don't know if you guys have seen that the Antebellum movie that's about to come out. Have you seen what that looks like?
I've seen what it looks like, but I haven't seen it.
I haven't seen it.
So, no, I don't think it's. Well, I don't know. You guys might get sneak previews. I don't think it's out yet, but I know that it's interesting because I've been looking at the whole idea of Black horror, right? The idea of Black, and it's interesting because as a person, I'm not a big horror fan now, but when I was a teenager, Freddy Krueger, Jason, I was into all of them, and it's interesting because I've noticed that there are people that I know who are filmmakers or who are interested in film who are Black who don't get the genre. They don't like it because it's like there's harshness, there's like humor. But if you ever watch like horror in general, there's always some element of some weird comedic thing that's going on usually inside of that. You know, Freddy Krueger was very funny, even though he was terrible and crazy. But I think I'm wondering about, so Antebellum is supposed to be the newest Jordan Peele thriller. And it's about Janelle Monáe is the main character, and she gets kind of like, it's horror because she gets pulled into slavery. She gets sucked into slavery from present day. And there's this weird connection. And that would be the horrific nightmare for any African American walking around. That's a horrible nightmare. But anyway, just wondering what you guys thought about kind of what's happening with Black people kind of expounding into other genres that they haven't historically been in when it comes to film. Thoughts?
Well, I think that horror is a genre, and there's a sort of culture around horror that a lot of folks are not aware of. And I've sort of learned this from some actors that are very sort of engulfed in the horror world. They go around actually to conventions and sign autographs and make thousands of dollars. People lining up around the corner because they were in. I have a friend who was in a movie called House of a Thousand Corpses. And he's got folks lining up around the corner because he looks like this ex-WWE wrestler. If you see him, he's 6'10" and 300 pounds. But you know, I think back to Candyman. I mean, Candyman is probably the most prominent role that we've seen. Is it Tony Todd or Tony Scott? I'm trying to remember the brother's name. Todd. Anyway, Candyman is probably the most prominent role we've seen of someone playing in that world. But in terms of horror, I mean. I don't want to admit it, but I mean, in blaxploitation, you had Blackula, but I'm not going to go. not a film that I want to promote to. It wasn't.
Wasn't there Blackula too?
I saw Blackula. I saw it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to say that was a great film, but it did sort of open some doors for actors of African descent to work in the world of horror in American film. And there has been roles for you've seen for African Americans and others in film, but they, you know, the old joke is they typically die off right away. In terms of directors and writing and having that opportunity, that I think Jordan Peele is taking this into you know, the world beyond. I mean, he had the Twilight Zone that he was producing on that, and now he's making all of these films and using, you know, his comedy platform to then transition into doing other things, which is writing, producing, and directing horror. And he's had 2 successful films, so Hollywood is like, please bring us money.
Yeah.
Derek, you were going to say something?
Well, I mean, I was going to say kind of like looking at horror like in symbolic terms, right? It's got something that I'd like to do with classes, right? And you think about, you know, at the center of the horror film is usually the monster, right? The killer, the monster, right? Whether it's Freddy Krueger or Jason or Jaws, or if you take it back to The Birth of a Nation, right? Who is the monster? The monster is that black marauding buck, right? That who's going to wreak havoc, you know, when they get freedom, right? And so horror films are usually a society's way of dealing with anxiety, right? It has fears about itself, right? And then what does it do? It projects that out into right? And so what we see in, of course, in Birth of the Nation and these early films where you see these monstrous black figures, like, you know, King Kong is like a symbolic sort of black person who is terrorizing New York City, right? And I think like what happens is
Over
that
the white woman, let's not forget that.
right, exactly, right, yeah, and what happens is that the sort of the white American imagination is horrified by itself, right? Horrified by the things that, you know, this culture has produced. And then it has to project that out onto something, right? So it projects it out onto these black, you know, these black figures who are monstrous and horrible, right? Who are horror figures. And then, like, if you come back into the era of like the slasher films that you're talking about, like, but here, you know, like, I can't watch those either. It's not for me. I don't do it, you know. But like, it's really interesting to see when that genre emerges, like, of like the Freddy films and the Jason films and those kind of things. It's in the 1970s in a moment of empowered femininity, right? After sexual feminism, where, you know, women are now able to sort of exercise control over their sexuality and so forth, right? And what you have these monsters which are coming to destroy those very figures, right? Those women
They
who
do get all the women. I didn't think about that.
Wow.
They come after the women.
And,
That's
and
right.
if you fornicate in the movie, you are the first
You're
one
gonna
to
die. Yeah, you're gonna
Right.
die. That's true. That's true.
Yeah.
That's
Wow.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
so,
I saw that. I saw that.
Think about
True.
that.
Yeah.
the beautiful thing about what Jordan Peele does in Get Out, right, is he finally is able to sort of convincingly turn the table, right? And it says, no, the monster is not us, right? We are actually the victim of this ambient sort of society in which anyone is potentially a monstrous threat to us. You know what I'm saying? And so
Yeah.
he kind of like turns the monster into
And she's wearing a Freddy Krueger shirt too. The girl.
And then so I'll just say this also is like Us is one of my is really, I think Us is only possible because of Black Panther, right? Because what Black Panther does is open up the whole range of possibility in terms of what kinds of roles Black people can play. And then what Jordan Peele does in Us is does something really which I think is first of its kind in Hollywood. It says, you know what? We're going to think about these fundamentally human questions, right? About what does it mean to be a human being who struggles between this lower self and this higher self,
Yourself.
right?
Sure.
And it's only now that Hollywood is allowing Black people to sort of fully engage in those kinds of, you know, deep philosophical questions with the greatest amount of, you know, funding, let's say. Now they're given the backing to do this, you know what I'm saying? And so Us is a great horror movie which goes into those like deep psychological spaces that we all wonder about. You know, what are we capable of, right? What horrors are we gonna produce, right? And you know, there's that great scene in the movie when it's that the little boy who's like kind of like the hero of the film, he says, anytime you stick a finger at someone else, point a finger at someone else, there's 3 pointing back at you, right? And so it's that kind of like that really deep sort of question about what does it mean to be a moral person living in the world today. And now Black people are able to ask that question about themselves, right? With the backing of all of this Hollywood you know, the Hollywood powerhouses.
You know, it's also, I think, elevating the conversation among Black people. What I've noticed a lot with Black people is that we've been so long the most oppressed in this country, right? That then we end up engaging in some interesting lateral oppression with other cultural groups, right? And not understand. So one of the things I think about a lot of times is, I was having this conversation with my daughter who was talking about cheap clothing, right? Oh, this store that I like to go to, Forever 21 or whatever it is, it's like the clothes are really cheap. That's why I like to go there. And we start talking about, but those are tiny hands probably somewhere in China who are making these clothes, right? So one of the things about the movie Us was that in order for them to exist the way that they were, someone was having to suffer. There was always an opposite, right? So if you're living a certain way, so the fact that I can go and I can buy a whole bunch of these cheap clothes, that is only possible because someone is suffering. And so, you know, even having those conversations, you know, with Black people, because again, it's hard to understand how Black people who've been so subjugated in this country can actually be in a position of privilege over other people in other communities. And that doesn't even come into I think our minds a lot because we're so focused on trying to survive and be okay ourselves. We don't recognize that we also are participating in this huge machine that is built off of oppressing other people. That's how the machine runs, right? And so I'm talking to one of my cousins who's in fashion, who's like, yeah, well, I may pay a whole bunch of money for this really thin t-shirt because it has this name on it, but it isn't tiny hands that are making it. But then I talk to somebody else who says, no, they send the tiny hands are making it. They send it to Italy to have them sew it in and say it's from Italy. Yeah. So it's all in some ways part of this gigantic machine. And so I think when cinema starts to help us start to have those kinds of conversations, because beyond what society thinks. We have to be internally looking at ourselves, at how are we growing and evolving within our own communities, within this, our community is just microcosm of the greater community, and success and making it. And what does that mean? And how does that look for the people who look like us, who aren't having that experience? So I think when it's done well, film, it actually makes us expand our own understanding of ourselves.
Okay, so I know we're coming to the end, but there's
we're almost at the end. This is crazy.
We have, again, this is why I love Wellness Wednesdays. I love this because, I want to thank you all really, but I really want to talk about Black female directors, which is a new emerging space that I'm loving. I'm loving these black female writers and directors and producers. Talk a little bit about them and how they're emerging. And I know, Perez, when you stepped out there, it was such a powerful moment for me because everyone that was working with me around Bound when I was in that film were women, right? And it was unique for me to be in that space. And they're emerging and they're doing front of the line kind of shows on television now. I'm amazed they just came with a force, right? And all of a sudden they were there, but you were one of the first.
I think one thing that I noticed with all these women of color is they've always been doing the work. One of the things that's most interesting is when it comes to, and I'm just gonna say white males because they just have to walk in and be like, hey, I got this thing, because I saw it happen. I got this thing, I wrote it here in this little toilet paper over here. It's a great idea. It's gonna cost $100 million. And then somebody's like, come in here, sit with these producers, let's discuss this. This is fantastic. How do we fund this? But for a Black, seriously, this has happened. And for a Black woman, you've got to come in like with binders of finished script. This is the lookbook. This is the cast. I've written letters to this and this and this person, and they're ready to go. And this is the budget, and this is how much it's gonna make. And it's insanity. And so that by the time the door opened, they were ready because they had their books. They had, what do you need? And women are just sending out emails. And I'm part of this organization that's called Women of Color Unite. And what we did is before the door opened, we're doing all the work in the back, but we're doing it together. So it's all these Black female filmmakers work. What do you need? I need a script. Who wants to direct? And so like one of my short films that's going to premiere at Cannes came up like that. I'm the writer, somebody else is the director, but we're all part of this organization. And so we're like, okay, who's writing, who's directing, who's casting, who's acting? And so it's just these Black women. And Bound came about, fascinatingly enough, was the subject matter. I want to deal with this. The only person who's available is this Black, my friend. She's like, you know what? I've been thinking about that too. So she gets on board. And then we're looking for a DP. This Black girl was like, I've only got it to DP, but she gets on board. So it just becomes this team that just creates itself very organically. And then we end up meeting you, and now we're all schlepping ourselves to Oregon and filming you. And then the film comes out. But what was funny about the film is you see all those women you saw around you. By the time we get to post-production, none. It's me in a room with 12 men. And they're talking to each other about what needs to be changed, but nobody's addressing me. And I'm just sitting there like, this is fascinating. And that was in 2016. So when I look at all these women coming out, all the Issa Raes, the Deniers, and all these other people who are opening these doors, and I have to say, Ava DuVernay has just really kicked it open and just created a show that's just a platform just to get Black women directing. Yes. That's what's going to help us get through that. But we also need to get people in the post-production part. We need to get composers. We need to get all those people in there so that you don't create a piece and then at the end of the day, you're sitting in a room with all these men, and bless their hearts, they can only operate as men, and you're just like watching them talk over you, and it's fascinating. But yes, I'm all for all these women. I'm really grateful for Ava DuVernay and what she's doing, Oprah, and for all these women out there. And I will tell you, it's not just one person. We're doing it as a united front. At least Black women, that much I know. Is that it is definitely a united front. That's why you're seeing them all. Because we're not walking one at a time. We're literally holding hands and walking in together. So that's why it's like a flood of
the answer. That's largely
the answer.
And I believe on a lot of levels, that is the greatest fear, is that we will come together. And again, I think that the fear has been just in my work and looking at, my area is an area of mental health. And the fear, which I consider a pathological fear, is that when we come together, I mean, the fear is that we're going to then destroy. We're then going to react, respond. We are going to pay you back, kind of a mentality, which has never happened. I mean, it's just never happened. And all of that fear that keeps getting generated around the country, everybody keeps talking about how afraid they are of Black people, but we're the ones getting killed. What I'm saying? That's it's just so irrational what I see happening. And at the same time, what I see happening with what I'm loving, I'm really so glad I lived long enough to see people smarter than me and people that are showing up in their lanes and doing incredible things, because I really do believe that the arts are so critical to moving us forward. I don't care how many people you get, leaders standing up at mics and all of that. At the end of the day, it's that foundation, that infrastructure of knowledge that is breaking through all of the nonsense. And I'm so happy, I'm so excited to see to have seen that folks that say, that are in their lanes. And I'm so happy to know all of you and to know that you're in those lanes doing the work you're doing and educating people and moving people beyond the superstitions and the ignorance. And again, what you all are teaching, unfortunately, I believe this needs to be in primary school. I believe this information, again, I didn't get to where I was. Matter of fact, I didn't see anything about me. Okay, going through I got 4 degrees and none of it was about Black people. And what was there was not correct. And so what I'm seeing now is that knowledge you all are, with the knowledge you're sharing, I could have used that in middle school. I think I could have wrapped my head around that information in middle school, right? But it's not in there. Matter of fact, everything we had is gone. So I'm glad that hopefully there's some folks minding the textbooks, which are a mess right now, right?
I think, but the thing about this, and before we go, I do want everyone to then, again, say who they are and how people can access your work. It's come up in the questions quite a bit, is wanting to know how they can connect to your work or where you're teaching or what it is. So make sure we bring that up. But also was just going to say that I think that there's a opportunity right now, because everyone is kind of recognizing that they've been drinking the Kool-Aid, even though everyone's been drinking the Kool-Aid and going, it's juice. They've realized at this point that they're just drinking sugar water. And now they are open, I think, to a certain extent. Like, I think if you were to get historians, filmmakers, artists, musicians to come together with some even very fundamental historical curriculum, you could really push for it right now. I think this is the time. I know that in Oregon, they just passed the ethnic studies bill. So they're trying to figure out how to do that so that they're actually, all of the ethnic studies in this country can be put into US history, because it's not there, and so being able to bring that in. But I think there's an opportunity now, because I think everybody recognizes that it's faulty.
But pre-COVID, they've been trying to destroy ethnic studies across the country.
Right.
Mm-hmm. So they're folding it into so many things that you don't even know what it is anymore.
In the Cal States as well. So I teach in the Cal State system and ethnic studies as a requirement course for students in their journey in school. They will be taking an ethnic studies course.
Nice.
My course.
Okay, that's where Tim is. Okay, how can they access your work, Paris?
Oh, well, if you want to watch Bound is on iTunes. It's on Amazon. I think if you have the Urban Movie Channel, you can get that on there. The rest of my work I think the rest of my work is not out yet. Some things are getting released this year. Some things are now being written for when COVID allows us to start filming again. So, but Bound, I encourage everybody, because it's a really great conversation starter. That's the reason it was really made, as Dr. Joy said, that we made it so that we could heal that wound. But in order to heal the wound, we have to talk to each other. And so we created something for people to start the conversation. So I recommend Bound, Africans versus African Americans, on iTunes.
All right.
Yes. And do your website?
My website, I'd have to type it down because I'm an African, so my website is an African name.
Well, you can put, if you put it in the chat, I'll put it in the main. Yeah.
Let me tell you, I've been in this country 15 years. I still have my accent. Some things are intentional. So,
And don't give it up. And don't give it up. Don't give it up.
I refused in Wisconsin when they were trying to get me to give up my accent. And I asked them, well, how will they know I'm African? So she was like, okay, do you? Here I am.
I'm putting you in the putting your website in the main chat. Okay, perfect.
Yes.
Okay, what about you, Mr. Derek, Dr. Derek?
So I'm not really very good with the let's say 21st century media. You can email me. I'll be happy to correspond with you via email. And and my book is on. You can get it on Amazon and so forth. If you're really interested in Black poetry,
What is your book called? Say it again.
It's called Robert Hayden in Verse. New Histories of African American Poetry in the Black Arts Era. So, it's about sort of a history of African American poetry in the 20th century, particularly one poet, Robert Hayden. And, I'll put my email address in the chat.
Do that, and I'll put it in. Well, do you want everybody emailing you? Are you sure?
I don't know. Like, I don't even know how many.
Wait a minute. Just wait a minute.
We have like 25,000 people that.
Okay. Maybe I
all
shouldn't do
kinds of
that.
stuff. But I got Tim. I got you, Tim. So I'm putting your stuff in here.
Yeah, you can search me up. You'll find me.
Do that. Let's start there.
Say what university you're at again.
At Claremont McKenna College.
Okay.
Which is CMC. That's what it's called.
All right. And Tim, you're at.
I'm at too many places, but I teach the Black Images on the Silver Screen at Cal State Northridge, and I teach film studies, media studies at Santa Monica College and LA Film School. Yeah.
Nice. I'm so excited. I'm so glad. And just again, I wanted to say, that we really do appreciate and respect the work of our brother who passed away. Certainly have kept his family in my prayers. So grateful for what he brought. So Wakanda forever.
Yes, and I will say I saw an actor on the newest movie that Spike Lee did was talking about how he told his wife that he felt like Chadwick was kind of precious, and he said that because he said there was a massage therapist that was rubbing his back, and then his wife was holding his hand, and I felt like he's let Hollywood kind of go to his head. And the man was, he was overtaken with tears and emotion because you just never know what people are going through. And so I think for one thing to just take away from that is to treat each other with some grace and compassion. We all have stuff going on. We have our opinions. I know I have strong personality and opinions, but just reminding me to give everybody a little grace, especially during this time. We're all struggling in some way. So that's what I'm taking from that. And the unity that I felt from what he tried to do with the characters he played, giving us a little grace. So.
He has one last film that's going to be out on, I think it's going to be streaming on Netflix soon. It's about, I'm trying to remember the name, but it's about Ma Rainey. It's sort of better in 1927. He's in that film.
Ma Rainey's Bottom, right? It's an August Wilson movie.
Yeah, it's based on August Wilson's writings, and it is produced, interestingly enough, by the man who gave him his really push to move forward, which was Denzel Washington.
Right.
Out of that sort of when he was able to go to London and study acting in the drama school there. So interesting how that all came full circle. Rest in peace. Rest in love.
Takes a village.
I'm telling you.
Well, thank you all so much for being on. I feel enriched and I've learned a whole lot. And again, for those of you that are listening and paying attention, spread the knowledge, spread the love. Thank you so much for being where you are and who you are. The world is better because you're in it.
Thank you.
Caressa, I feel like we're supposed to be besties. I feel like my spirit is bonded right here. This is like a person. I'm like, Mom,
all of y'all.
get on my life.
You have my information.
Like my twin. What is happening?
You have my information.
Okay, I got you. I'm reaching out. We're gonna
You have
connect.
my information, right? Good.
Yeah, I got you. We're gonna connect. All right. Good to see everybody. See y'all later.
Bye.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.